US Chess Championship 2025 features the best American chess players Fabiano Caruana, Wesley So, Levon Aronian, the one and only Hans Niemann in the open section, Alice Lee, and 8-time US champion Irina Krush in the women's section. Round 8 presented us with a lot of great games, and I want to start with Andy Woodward against Hans Niemann. Andy Woodward is the youngest American grandmaster at 15 years old. Tremendous talent. He starts with d4, knight f6, knight f3, e6, c4, d5. Knight develops to c3 and knight d7. Queen's gambit declined because the pawn on c4 was not taken by black. Bishop develops to f4 and pinning the knight with bishop b4 for Niemann. Exchange of the pawns on d5, e3 to develop a light square bishop on a square d3, and immediate strike in the center with c5 for Niemann. Bishop develops to d3, c4. The bishop moves away to c2 and queen a5, putting the pressure on the knight on c3. Castle for white, and it's not a good idea to take the knight and then the pawn on c3 because white would play bishop d6 and black cannot castle. And not castling is much more important here in this type of positions than a pawn. Let's go back. Niemann plays castle himself. a4, a6, knight goes to e5, and now Hans Niemann decided to take the knight and the pawn on c3. Andy plays knight takes d7, exchange of the minor pieces, and a very nice move, queen b1, attacking the pawn on b7. Very difficult to protect that pawn because rook on b8 cannot go because the bishop, the dark square bishop, is controlling that square. If bishop c6, let's say to protect the pawn, white wins after bishop d6, attacking the rook. And if rook moves away, bishop b4, and it turns out the black queen is trapped. Has no moves, and black loses a queen. So very nice idea here for black. For white, I'm sorry. So the pawn on b7 cannot be really protected. Queen a5, queen takes b7, rook c8. Again, this very nice square for the rook would be b8 on open file, attacking the rook, but it's protected by a beautifully positioned dark square bishop on f4. Rook b1, queen goes back to c3, queen b2 is rather passive to protect the knight, the bishop on c2. Knight goes to e4, queen c1, bishop, queen goes back to a5, and rook penetrates into the 7th rank, rook b7. Cannot really stand that rook on such an active position, therefore bishop c6 makes perfect sense, and rook has to come back to b2, c3. And that's actually a mistake, although it doesn't look like one, but it's a mistake because the pawn on c3 becomes weak. Very difficult to protect it. Rook b3, bishop d7, and rook a3, attacking the pawn from actually doubling the rook on the 3rd rank. Not usually you can see that type of doubling of the rook. g5, immediately striking, attacking, hitting the bishop on f4. Bishop moves away. Rook c6 to double the rook on c file c to protect the pawn on c3, but it's too late because Andy takes the knight and takes the pawn on c3. Rook c8, exchange of the rooks on c6, and queen d1. Bishop g4, interesting geometric idea, cannot take the bishop on g4 because of the checkmate on the 1st rank. And in this position, Andy plays f3. Also very logical. Bishop f5, h3, queen d5, blocking the movement of the pawn d, f4, and very, very nice move. And it turns out that the bishop on f5 is not a good piece anymore because it's surrounded by the pawns of the same color and really doesn't have a lot of squares to maneuver. h6, rook b3, king g7, and a rook b8. And this position is much better here. Queen d6, hitting the rook on b8, and now comes a grandmaster type of move, d5. That's probably the move that Niemann didn't see. And now after f6 and king h2, he takes the rook on b8, and Andy takes the rook on c6, has an extra pawn, and that pawn is pretty much deciding the game because it's a passing pawn, 2 squares away from promoting. Niemann attacks it, Andy defends it, g4, exchange of the pawns, check, and another pawn is grabbed, and now white has 2 extra pawns, bishop f5, queen c4, exchange of the queens. White have 2 extra pawns, and despite the fact that the bishops are of opposite color, dark square for white, light square for black, white has a very easy win here. f5 is on the way, so f5 himself by Niemann, exchange of the pawns, king h3, bishop d5, and c7, and the pawn is 1 square away from promoting, so obviously black has to play bishop e6 to protect the promotion square. The rest of the game I will go quickly. What happens here is simply white improves the position on the bishop first, blocks the pawn on a6, and then moves the king to the queen side of the board, where the action is, plays f5, and after bishop takes g2 and f6, basically it's clear that black cannot stop both pawns. One of them would promote. Bishop h3, and now very nice final touch, queen. Queen on c8, Niemann resigns because after king takes c8, f7, and the pawn cannot be stopped and becomes a queen. Very nice win by Andy Woodward. He is having a very nice tournament. He is not one of the leaders, but he is in the middle of the pack. And for a 15-year-old, that's a very, very good result. Another game I want to show you today is between one of the favorites of the tournament, before it started, Levon Aronian against Sam Shankland. Aronian plays white, he starts with e4, and we have a Sicilian defense. c5, knight f3, d6, d4, exchange of the pawns, knight f6, hitting the pawn on e4, is protected by the knight, a6, all theory, developing the bishop on e2, e6, bishop e3, knight d7. Those type of moves are made, obviously, but thousands and thousands of times by both players, and g4. Starting attack on the king side of the board, very popular move these days, h6, f4. Levon Aronian starts marching his pawns like an avalanche of pawns are going to crash black's position. b5, g5, exchange of the pawns on g, and rook h3. We are 11 moves into the game, and the position is pretty crazy already. So the rook is hitting the bishop on e3. It's pretty clear that black do not even plan to castle in this game, because they obviously cannot castle short side because the rook is no longer there, and long side would be also a suicide because it's all open here, and white would simply crash black's position. White, on the other hand, can still castle, but it's also not clear where. Bishop goes back, knight goes back to the square where it started the game on g8, and very nice move, g6. And now if f takes pawn on g6, knight would take on e6. So that's a very nice idea in those type of position. Therefore, queen f6, bishop h5, bishop goes to the edge of the board. Position remains pretty crazy with the rook on h3 all of a sudden. Now, black takes the pawn on g6 because the pawn on e6 is actually protected by the queen, and also the bishop is under attack. But after bishop g4, turns out that white's position is clearly better. There is a double attack on the rook and the pawn on e6, And Sam Shankland sacrifices an exchange, sacrifices a rook on a square c3, and that was actually the best move in this position. Pawn takes rook, and knight goes to a very juicy square on e5. Isolated pawn on e4. It's always a good idea to put the knight in front of it. So that's chess 101. Those pawns are doubled. This is an isolated pawn. This is an isolated pawn. So although white have an extra exchange, those pawns are pretty bad. And therefore, this position, according to the computers, is pretty even overall. Bishop h3, g5, with the idea to move forward with g4, a4. Levon is starting on the other side of the board. Queen h6, hitting the bishop. Bishop goes back to the square where it started the game. White's king is still in the middle of the board, same with black king. Knight f6. Sam Shankland decides to involve a knight in the game. Taking the pawn on b5. Now black cannot take the pawn back because they will lose a rook. Therefore, knight takes e4. What a crazy position, by the way. Really, really difficult to calculate here, all these variations. But I'll be honest with you, the fact that Sam Shankland has 1 hour and 21 minutes still remaining in the game tells me that he saw this in the past, or maybe even right before the game when he was preparing for his opponent. All this is not new to him. So knight takes e4, pawn takes a6, g4. Pawn on a6 is obviously very dangerous. 2 squares away from promotion. Queen c1 to exchange the offer to exchange the queens. Queen goes to h7. Sam Shankland says no to the idea of exchanging the queens. Bishop b5 check. King f7, and all of a sudden on move 24 we have a castle. Castle is on the board with some discovery checks ideas, and therefore the black's king is moving away to g8, bishop g3, bishop e7, and bishop takes e5. Pawn takes, bishop d3. And now it's not a good idea to take the knight on d4 because bishop on the knight on e4 is pinned and it's going to be lost after queen f4, hitting the knight, threatening to check on f7 and win the bishop on e7. White's position is totally winning here. Black plays g3. Here it's an important moment of the game, maybe the most important part of the game. In this position, there was only one move that equalized position for black, and that move was not easy to find. Queen h4. That was the move. Bishop takes e4 and g3, and that's the idea. Attacking the bishop and attacking the checkmate on h2. And black's position is absolutely fine here. It's an even position according to the ancients. Queen h4 was not easy to find, and Sam Shankland plays g3 with basically the same ideas of checkmate on h2. But it's not that good because simply pawn takes, queen g6, attacking the pawn on g3, but queen e1 not only protects the pawn, but also hitting the knight on e4. And now we have queen takes g3, exchange of the queens. Rook is under attack, knight is under attack, but after rook b1 and black taking the knight, it turns out that although black have a material advantage here, two minor pieces for a rook, that's better for black, but the pawn on a7 is absolutely an absolute key in this position. This pawn decides the game. Bishop d6, pawn take, king f8, king f2. The kings are going to the middle of the board, which is normal for endgames. c4, king d8, and a rook g1. Hitting the knight on g3. And now if knight goes away, we have bishop e4, and black would lose a rook. Therefore, knight has to stay on g3 to protect the square e4. We have bishop b7, c5, hitting the bishop, bishop f4, and simple exchange on g3. White has an extra pawn, and most importantly, they have a passing pawn on a7. Converting this position for a grandmaster is very easy, so I'll go quickly here. After exchange of the rooks, we have bishop c4, hitting the pawn, and the king simply moves to the queen side of the board, then it comes back, and in this position, exchange of the pawns, black resigns. White resigns because after king takes e5, there is bishop f3. Bishop f3, hitting the bishop on a8, and obviously after exchange of the bishops, with the next move, white promotes to a pawn 8. Very important win for Levon, and now he has 5 points out of 8, and we'll look at the standings at the end of the video, but going ahead, I'll tell you that he is one of the leaders of the tournament right now. One more game I want to show you today is from the women's section. Our favorite player, Alice Lee, whose games I am showing on most of the streams. She's playing absolutely beautiful chess. She plays against Tatev Abrahamyan. Starts with d4, d5, c4, e6, knight f3, knight d7. Also Queen's Gambit declined. And after g3, actually it becomes accepted because pawn on c4 falls, bishop g2, rook b8. The idea for this move is that b5 move is now possible to protect the pawn on c4 against future attacks of white. And obviously, in this position, b5 is not possible because it's very dangerous, some jumps with the knight, and the rook would be under attack. So rook b8 makes sense. a4, also very pragmatic move, not allowing the move. b5 for black. a6, insisting that they want to play, Tatev want to play b5 anyway, and a5 again, preventing this move, because now after b5 we have en passant take here. Bishop d6, knight d2, hitting the pawn on c4, b5, en passant, knight takes b6, and although it seems like black have an extra pawn and everything is protected, those pawns are really weak. Pawn on a6 is isolated, pawns on c7 and c4 are doubled. So white have slight advantage. In this position, they castle, knight e7, and knight takes c4. There is not one game, I think, in this tournament where Alice didn't sacrifice something. Knight takes c4, sacrifice of the knight, taking the pawn, using the geometry of the board. After knight takes c4, we have queen a4 check, and with the next move, white takes the knight back. Castle, knight g5. This move is not made to attack anything. This move is made to reposition white's knight into a very nice square on e4. h6 only helps that. Knight e4, knight f5. Not really a bad position for black, despite those weak pawns. It's pretty even according to the engines. Rook a4, protecting one more time the pawn on d4. e5, d5, and bishop b7, attacking the pawn on d5. And Alice in this position just plays knight c3, not only defending the pawn on d5, but also hitting the rook on b5. Position remains still pretty even. Rook b6, rook d1, rook e8, bishop goes to a nice square e4, queen defends the knight on f5, and bishop goes back to b1. In this position, it was logical to assume that Tatev would place the knight on a very nice square on d4, but instead she decides to go back to e7. not the best move here. Queen h4. The best continuation for white was, by the way, queen d3, and creating this battery to attack the check on h7. Queen h4, f5. Black's position now looks maybe even better. Queen h5, rook f8, e4. e4 and bishop c5. And now it becomes clear that white cannot really allow themselves to open f file, because the pawn on f2 would be under a tremendous pressure from the bishop and the rook. Rook c4, bishop goes to d4. Very nice square for a bishop. It looks great there. And Alice immediately decides to get rid of this bishop with knight e2. Pawn takes, knight takes d4, pawn takes, and a rook takes d4. Rook f6, doubling the rook, attacking the pawn on f2. Bishop e3 develops the bishop and protects the pawn. Knight f5, again, black's position looks absolutely fine here. Already some threats in this position, but rook takes e4, and after this exchange, white simply has an extra pawn. But black are still fine, because they have very active rooks. The problem for black is, though, that they cannot take the pawn on f2. If they could take the pawn on f2, of course, that would solve all their problems. So in this position, let's take one move back. In this position, if a rook takes f2, white wins on a spot with queen g6. Queen g6, and let's say rook f6 attacking the queen, queen h7 check, king f7, bishop g6, rook takes g6, and rook f1 check. And let's say rook f6, we have rook takes f6, pawn cannot take, king takes f6, rook f3 check, king e7, queen takes g7, and with the next move, white would take the rook. So, long combination, and maybe not easy to find, but on a grandmaster level, that's pretty easy for them to calculate those 5-6 moves, which are forced, by the way. And queen d6, so cannot take the pawn on f2 again. And now f4 protects the pawn, so white has an extra pawn and a little better position. Queen e5 to protect the rook on e3, rook d6, hitting the pawn on d5 with 3 pieces, and white decides not to protect that pawn, not to play passively, but exchange the queens on c3 and allow black to take the pawn on d5, which Tatev could actually do here. She could take the pawn with the bishop, which would have been better, and the game would have been pretty much even, with slight advantage for white. But she decides to play c6. The move makes sense. Maybe she wanted to play for a win. Cannot take the pawn on c6 because the rook on d1 would be under attack. Rook e1. King f7. So black didn't want to allow white to penetrate into the 7th ring. That's why they didn't want to take the pawn right away. But king f7 is decisive mistake of the game, because Alice Lee finds a beautiful response. Now, here I also want to mention that Tatev has 37 seconds left in the game, and she still had to make 5 more moves till the clock is restarted, and she made that big mistake. But again, it's not easy to find why this is a mistake, and the mistake is because of the next move. A rook c1. That's a beautiful move. And the reason this move pretty much wins the game is because now black cannot take the pawn on d5 with neither the rook or the pawn. If rook takes bishop a2 pins the rook, and the rook is gone. If pawn takes d5, rook c7 check, and the bishop is gone. In this position, already lost position, Tatev plays rook d8. We have d takes c6, and white have 2 extra pawns and easily winning position. Exchange of the rooks. Actually, I'm sorry, rook d1 check, king f2, bishop c8, bishop a2 check, king f6, exchange of the rooks now, and bishop and rook goes to c2, not allowing any counterplay for black. So rook d2 check is not possible. King e7, bishop c4, king d6, bishop e2. Just simple conversion of a winning position, repositioning the bishop to f3 to make sure that the pawn on c6 is always protected. Rook h2, another attempt to create some counterplay and take the pawn on h2. Obviously, it's not allowed. King g2, rook b1, and c7. The passing pawn is one square away from promotion. Black really do not have anything in store here. A5, h3, and Tatev resigns. And the reason she resigns, because there is no answer for the next move for white, bishop g4. So let's say a4, bishop g4, and you have to exchange those bishops, and with the next move, the pawn will promote to a queen. So another great win by Alice Lee. Let's take a look at the standings in the women's section. Alice Lee, who just turned 16, by the way, during this tournament, is a sole leader with 6 points out of 8. 4 players, Carissa Yip, Anna Zatonsky, Hanna Sargsyan, and Nazi Paikidze, are trailing by 1 point. Let's take a look at the standings after round 8 in the open section. Caruana and Wesley So, 2 favorites before the tournament started, are leading with 5.5 points out of 8. Levon Aronian is another favorite. He is half a point behind. Hope you enjoyed the games I showed you today. Like and subscription would be greatly appreciated, and thank you for watching.